ahead and get started. So I'm going to share with you 3 different research projects that I've worked on, or I am working on. The first projects are based on the science that I do explicitly on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and reflect my sort of social science research that I do aimed at identifying barriers and solutions to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or I might say DEI throughout the talk, in STEM and academia. And then I'm going to close with a project highlighting how I infuse an equity lens into the work that I do in ecology. More specifically, I do a lot of work in acoustic ecology. And so I'm interested in looking at the consequences of inequitable noise pollution for conserving healthy wildlife and human communities. And so that's where we're headed. And so, as I mentioned, I'd like to start out by highlighting a study that I conducted a few years ago, looking at faculty engagement in DEI activities. And so this, I think, matters, or why I think this matters, is because there's a well-documented literature on the benefits of diversity for science. So research has shown that diverse teams are more productive and innovative, have better problem-solving skills, have higher impact research, and produce research that's more relevant to society because the scientists themselves better reflect the broader community. But many groups are underrepresented in STEM. And so this data from the NSF is looking at workers in science and engineering occupations and demonstrates that white men are overrepresented at 49% relative to 31% in the US population. White women are underrepresented at 18%. Asian men and women are overrepresented, although I will note that Asian men and women are underrepresented in my field of ecology. And then Black men and women and Hispanic men and women are also underrepresented relative to the US population. And of course, I want to note that this is just looking at race, ethnicity, and gender, but I want to acknowledge that many other identities beyond race and gender are also underrepresented. But our team was interested in evaluating faculty contributions to DEI activities because faculty do play strong roles in hiring, training, and mentoring the next generation of scientists. And faculty can impact DEI through the abundant service and teaching work that they do. And we also noted from our own colleagues and interactions that many faculty do feel committed to DEI, but often face barriers to participation and engagement in these types of activities. And so we wanted to conduct a study to explicitly address some research questions around DEI engagement. So we were interested in understanding how ecology and evolutionary biology faculty value and participate in DEI activities, and what demographics of faculty are associated with engagement, and then what faculty perceive as the key motivations or barriers for participation, and then what approaches might reduce those barriers. And so we sent out a survey of faculty across the US in ecology and evolutionary biology, and we obtained responses from 469 individuals. 87% or so identified as white or Caucasian, about half as male, about 22% first generation, half full professors, and about a quarter each assistant and associate professors. And we found that faculty do value DEI for a variety of reasons. So along the x-axis here, you could see the level of agreement or disagreement. And few faculty value DEI work or activities because they thought it would increase their chance of getting tenure. Some thought it would potentially increase their chance of earning grants. More thought engagement in DEI activities would make their research more relevant to a broader community. And many felt morally obligated to do so, wanted to improve the quality of their research, wanted to increase scientific literacy, and train diverse future leaders. We also found that underrepresented faculty were doing more work or engaging in DEI work more frequently. And by underrepresented, this includes those that identify as racial or ethnic minorities, cisgender women and non-binary folks, and first-generation faculty. And so these groups were spending more time recruiting minority students and faculty, doing K-12 outreach, serving on diversity committees, organizing and attending diversity workshops, and authoring diversity publications. And unsurprisingly, probably to many, faculty considered limited time and funding as the biggest barriers to engagement in DEI. And so, but still other factors were important barriers, such as insufficient knowledge of best practices or language and cultural barriers, yet these were not considered to be major limitations. And then on the flip side of that, over 2/3 of our respondents ranked having more time and more funding as the primary pathways for overcoming those barriers. And so to summarize what we found and how we can use this information to promote greater shared responsibility for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we did find that marginalized groups were bearing the primary responsibility of creating a more diverse and inclusive culture, yet these activities were not perceived as being valued in promotion and tenure. And so we suggest if we really want to move the needle on diversity, equity, and inclusion, these responsibilities should be shared by all faculty. And so one way to do this is that institutions should invest resources to catalyze faculty engagement. And so one example of this is here in my home department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation at Colorado State University. Our department chair recently invested funds to hire a TA to essentially develop inclusive content and infuse diverse content into our course materials. And so that essentially devoted funds to also addressing the limited time that faculty have to diversify their course materials, and then provided an opportunity for a TA to engage in some of this DEI education work. So it's one example of a solution in a way that an institution may invest resources to address some of these barriers that have been identified by faculty, such as limited time and funding. But we also suggest that institutions, if they really want to incentivize engagement in DEI, should place greater value on these activities and tenure and promotion. And this isn't too crazy of an idea. Purdue University is actually doing this right now. So they've created a new pathway to tenure centered on work in DEI. Okay, so that's a quick summary of that research. So now I want to move on to share the findings from a paper that was recently accepted to Bioscience by Dr. Liba Pechar and I on the use of diversity statements in faculty hiring. And so this work specifically provides a framework for evaluating diversity statements. And so we really hope that this will be out in time for the next and upcoming round of faculty hires. And why this matters is because we perceive that there is a current disconnect where institutions are increasingly requesting diversity statements for faculty applicants. But there's little guidance that exists on how search committees can evaluate these statements. And so, again, we outlined some research objectives. We wanted to understand, first of all, what criteria should search committees consider when using DEI statements to evaluate an applicant? And then what methods other than DEI statements or diversity statements are useful for assessing an applicant's potential to contribute to DEI? And then what are some advantages and challenges of using these statements to evaluate faculty candidates? And so again, we sent out a survey this time of experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion at 210 US academic institutions. And these included public, private, predominantly white institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, and women's colleges. And 90% of our respondents reported holding a role or position related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we felt fairly confident that we did indeed obtain a sample of experts in DEI. And experts did agree on the disconnect that we perceived. So 91% of respondents agreed that DEI statements should be required, Yet at the same time, 85% indicated that they lacked institutional guidance for evaluating these statements. The experts outlined a variety of criteria that could be used to evaluate a candidate's contributions to DEI, and we organized these into 6 sort of broad themes. And so the most commonly cited theme was having cultural or DEI competency. And this included things like awareness of systemic barriers and inequities faced by marginalized groups in society and academia, or awareness of your own bias and privilege and how that shows up in the various roles that you play, or how can you use your own privilege to advocate for others, and then awareness of important DEI terms, such as the difference between equity or equality or diversity and inclusion and why that matters. And then another commonly cited theme was actions and accountability. So having some sort of track record or evidence of the work that you've done in DEI. And then another common theme was DEI in teaching. So this could be using inclusive pedagogy practices, or having evidence of teaching diverse students, or infusing diversity and diverse perspectives into your course materials, things like that. And then the next common cited theme was DEI service. So this is things like service on diversity committees, diversity initiatives, doing K through 12 outreach to underserved communities, that kind of thing. The next theme was promoting underrepresented scholars. And so this is things like evidence of mentoring and supporting diverse students and recruiting diverse students, or evidence of working with diverse groups in research or in non-research settings. And then finally, infusing DEI into research. So this really is examples of doing research on DEI, such as what I'm presenting right now, or integrating DEI into the research that you do, like the next topic I'm going to talk about, or even just thinking about how your research might impact diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we organized all of this information and coded these themes and coded sub-themes within these themes, and we organized this into an evaluation framework that we hope will be useful for evaluating candidates. And I'm just showing you a small piece of that here, just to provide an example. So under the theme of actions, plans, and accountability, there are many sub-themes that were identified, and one of those might be accountability and metrics, and a definition of excellence in that might look like providing numerous measures of success, quantifying the impact of your DEI work. And so we hope, again, that this will be a useful tool and can be used in faculty hiring and putting some clarity around the use and evaluation of these statements. Although most experts agreed that these statements should be required of applicants, 77% also indicated that there were other methods than these statements alone that could be useful for assessing an applicant's potential to contribute to DEI, including requesting that letter writers and address candidates' DEI commitment in their recommendations, evaluating DEI contributions in research, teaching statements, and other materials, using surveys or behavioral assessments or screening questions to evaluate DEI knowledge, also asking questions related to DEI during interviews and job talks, and having candidates meet with DEI committees, or soliciting explicit evidence of engagement with DEI work. Experts also indicated that there were several advantages, but also some challenges of using diversity statements in faculty hiring. So some advantages highlighted included demonstrating a candidate's genuine interest and awareness and commitment to DEI, demonstrating how a candidate will interact with colleagues and students, signaling an institutional commitment to DEI, engendering that commitment to DEI in the candidate, raising awareness of the need for DEI work more generally, and broadening qualifications to include or recognize DEI work. Some of the challenges highlighted including that these statements do not ensure that the candidate is sincere or will maintain a future commitment to DEI. And so really, DEI commitment should be demonstrated through other materials as well. And also, some experts thought that these statements would be less useful if the institution lacked DEI core values, or if the institution was unable to evaluate candidates effectively. And then a smaller subset thought that the statements would put an unfair burden on non-minoritized individuals or those that didn't prioritize DEI or have opportunities to do DEI work. So to summarize this work, we found that these statements are considered to be a valuable tool for measuring DEI contributions, but that the burden of evaluating them is largely falling on search committees that have little guidance. And also the most critical evaluation criteria experts considered to be were evidence of DEI competency and evidence of a track record in DEI work. And then also DEI statements alone are not enough and should be supplemented with other materials. And then we hope that we have provided a framework that can be flexibly adapted to meet diverse needs of positions and institutions. Okay, and so I want to summarize sort of this whole section by talking about some broad and big picture perspectives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I guess my big takeaway from this part of the talk is that to really advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, I feel that we sort of need to start with ourselves, right? And so we need to first start with self-awareness, our own competency, our own knowledge of our biases and privileges, and how those show up in the roles that we play, and our own knowledge of the awareness of the systemic biases that have led to inequities. And once we have done a good job around our own competency, we will be better at creating inclusive spaces. And when we're better at creating inclusive spaces, we will attract diversity because people will see that we have done the work to make our institutions and our labs and everything more inclusive, right? And so again, I really think we need to start with ourselves. I feel like most institutions and individuals in some cases start with diversity, start here, right? And you know, so the idea is if we sort of get more diversity, we'll solve our diversity problem. And I really think we just need to start with ourselves. Not to say that we can't do all of these things simultaneously, but I think DEI competency begets inclusion, which begets diversity. All right, so that sort of summarizes my DEI work, explicitly focusing on that. And now I want to show you an example of how I infuse an equity lens into the work that I do in ecology. And specifically, I do a lot of work in acoustic ecology. And so I'm interested in the consequences of noise pollution for wildlife, and more specifically in equitable noise pollution for conserving healthy wildlife and human communities. Okay, so urban ecosystems are influenced by interactions among human activities, infrastructure, and biotic factors that shape biological patterns and processes. But urban landscapes are also defined by legacies of social inequity. So systemic biases have underpinned policies, urban planning practices, and lending practices that shape the distribution of resources across urban ecosystems. And one strong example of this is the practice of redlining in US cities employed in the US from 1933 to 1968. And this is where literally communities were outlined in red and targeted for either disinvestment if you were outlined in red, or investment if you were outlined in green. And so what do I mean by this? So the Homeowners Loan Corporation developed these different grades from A to D, where A was considered best and where mortgage lenders would make maximum loans up to 80% of appraisal. D communities were deemed as hazardous, and using the original language, characterized by detrimental influences and an undesirable population or infiltration of it. And it was recommended that lenders refuse to make loans in these areas. And these were communities of color. And this process of investment or disinvestment has led to the unequal distribution of environmental amenities, such as green space cover, or disamenities, such as heat islands or environmental pollutants. And so to give you an example of this, I'm going to take you through a series of maps focused on Denver. And so here you can see the distribution of these redlined neighborhoods. So this is in Denver. And I apologize for those that are colorblind. I recognize that the colors chosen by A2LC are not colorblind friendly. Turns out they weren't thinking about accessibility when they're outlining communities for disinvestment. But I will orient you. So here you have the redlined neighborhoods, and then sort of surrounding that is the yellow lined areas, and then green and blue lined. And these are the ones where they are better invested in, the green and blue communities. Okay, so that's Denver. That's orienting you to the distribution of Holt grades in Denver. And you can see that indeed redlined areas do map to racial diversity. So the darker areas on the map here are areas with a higher percentage of minority populations, and those are also pretty well aligned with those redlined districts. And redlined neighborhoods in Denver have lower tree cover. So the polygons here in sort of this tan color overlap fairly well with those redlined neighborhoods, and those areas have less than 15% of tree cover, whereas those here with the darker green color have around 35 to 70% tree cover. Redline neighborhoods have more impervious surfaces. So this sort of darker reddish color on the background map here indicates more impervious surface cover, and whitish colors indicate less. And so you can see that there's a greater distribution of those darker colors in the redline neighborhoods. Redline neighborhoods have more toxic release sites. So here you're looking at point markers for the different toxic release sites across Denver, and you can see a greater distribution through those historically redlined neighborhoods. Redline neighborhoods have more flood zones. So the dark blue here is showing the areas with 100-year flood zones. And you can see again, sort of this greater distribution or concentration of flood zones in the redline neighborhoods in Denver. And all of these factors, including many other social factors, contribute to these redline neighborhoods having overall lower life expectancy. And again, here an example from Denver, where the redline communities tend to have life expectancy around 67 to 76 years, whereas these green line communities have around 82 to 89 years on average life expectancy. And so this relates to the well-documented literature indicating negative health outcomes in redline neighborhoods. So redlining is associated with exposure to environmental hazards, preterm births, cancer stage at diagnosis, asthma, and many other self-reported health issues. And low-income neighborhoods have been shown to be especially vulnerable to heat-related illness. And of course, this also relates to COVID. Several studies have recently shown that the greater air pollution in redline neighborhoods, or these segregated neighborhoods, have led to dramatic impacts around COVID. So the 5 most segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia had twice the COVID-19 case rate than the 5 least segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And this inequitable access is also important with respect to access to green space cover, right? So we've all probably been spending more time outside with COVID because it's a way for us to more safely socialize. And yet, if you're in a community that has less access to green space cover, you have fewer of those opportunities. And so there's considerable evidence that many environmental resources are inequitably distributed. But as someone that works in acoustic ecology, I'm particularly interested in whether noise pollution is inequitably distributed, and then what are the impacts to wildlife, because I am a wildlife biologist. And so there is evidence that communities of color do experience greater noise pollution relative to predominantly white communities. But there's been no research to date specifically focused on the distribution of noise with respect to redlining. And so the answer to that question is yes, noise pollution is inequitably distributed. So how do I get to that conclusion? So my team and I evaluated the distribution of noise using transportation noise from the US Department of Transportation. We mapped this data to 71 different US cities and calculated summary statistics on excess noise. So this is noise above 45 decibels for each of those different Holt grades for each city. We also calculated this N metric, which is just an area corrected measure of excess noise. So here, little r is the area covered by noise above 45 decibels in a Holt grade, multiplied by the median value of noise for that Holt grade, divided by the overall area for that Holt grade. So again, just an area corrected measure of excess noise. And again, we found that noise is inequitably distributed. So here, going back to Denver, you can see those same redline neighborhoods and a greater distribution of these darker black pixels. And these are representing areas where noise is above 100 decibels. So again, more surface area covered by these pixels representing greater noise. And then if you look at that excess noise metric in the green line neighborhoods, it's 10.5 and it over doubles to 24.2 in red line neighborhoods. Similar patterns you can see in Miami. So again, more dark pixels around the red line neighborhoods and metric increasing from 37 to 46. Same pattern in the Bay Area. So looking at San Francisco and metric going from 26 to 44, Oakland from 8 to 39, and more dark pixels aligning with the red line neighborhoods. And there's definitely consequences of this for human health. So Hammer et al. Back in 2014 estimated that over 100 million Americans are exposed to noise levels above 70 decibels, and that there are many health consequences for people at this level of noise. So including decreased sleep quality and quantity, increased annoyance, stress, distraction, and temporary changes in hearing that can lead to hypertension, reduced learning and productivity, and endocrine disruption, which can lead to heart disease and permanent hearing loss. And we also, or what I was really interested in, as I mentioned earlier, is whether inequitable noise matters for wildlife. And why I think this is important is because there's been well-documented impacts from noise on wildlife from diverse sources, including environmental noise, transportation noise, industrial noise, military, and other noises. And impacts have been seen across diverse biological responses from vocal behaviors, movement, physiology, population metrics, vigilance, mating, foraging, fitness, and community level metrics. And noise has been shown to shape the areas where animals occur. And so noise may make certain suitable habitats unsuitable, reducing habitat areas, such as this study by Dorte et al., who found that marmosets were avoiding areas that had higher noise levels here around the perimeter, even though these same areas had much better food resources. They were still avoiding these high quality habitat areas because of the high noise levels. And so preliminary evidence from my lab suggests that inequitable noise does matter for wildlife. So we conducted a literature review of 223 papers looking at noise impacts to urban wildlife from 1990 to 2021. 66 papers of this review reported specific noise levels that were driving the impact that they observed. And so each marker or increment here doesn't represent an increasing number of species responses, but instead represents an increasing number of studies documenting a response at a given noise level. So this cumulative response curve suggests an accumulation of evidence that higher noise levels matter for wildlife. So if noise didn't matter, we would expect this asymptote to be much lower, around 45 decibels. but it doesn't even seem to truly start to asymptote until above 100 decibels. And because that data is sparse, it's not even clear if that's a true asymptote. And there are important limitations to what we've done here. So the literature that we evaluated is not designed explicitly to test this question. And one important example of this is the undersampling in redlined areas. As again, you're sort of seeing few data points out in those higher noise levels. And not all taxa or biological responses are represented, right? So vocal behaviors have been well studied, and things like life history or reproduction have been less studied. Birds have been well studied, and herps have been less studied. And so there's a lot of gaps there, right? And what I'm really hoping to do is address some of those knowledge gaps. And so I'm launching some research in 2022, partnering with folks in the Urban Wildlife Information Network, explicitly some groups out of the Bay Area, Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta that are collaborating with me on this research, where we're interested in measuring noise distribution across these different Holt grades, and then pairing that with field observations on medium to large mammals, birds, bats, and herps. And so that is sort of my teaser, in the hope that you will invite me back in the future to share what we find from that work. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the many individuals that contributed to the work that I've shared here today, and the many funding sources. And I thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Bombaci. Really, so I know that Bridget, she is here, is going to take over the Q&A, but I just want to thank you again before we get started there. And for all of our participants, just to let you know, we're going to send out a free-form survey after this talk, where you will have the opportunity to provide some direct feedback to Dr. Bombaci and let her know what you learned and what you found interesting, and just anything you want to share with her about the talk. So just wanted to remember to let everybody know that, and I will pass it over to Bridget now for the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Thank you so much, Dr. Bombaci, for such an amazing talk. Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget Smith, and I'll be moderating our question and answer section for today. So we'll now like to open it up to the audience. So please feel free to use the chat, or to use the raise your hand feature and unmute your mic to ask Dr. Bombaci any questions regarding the talk. So we have a question in the chat from Jordan Rickson. What exactly are the toxic release sites, and how are they regulated / chosen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the toxic release sites that I presented in Denver are essentially these areas where hazardous waste have been released, either from industry or other point pollutant sources. I actually don't know the answer to the second part of that question, is how they are regulated or chosen. I think I can say more broadly, not how those specific sites are chosen, but in general, communities that have been redlined historically, or often communities of color, the vast literature on environmental justice documents that those communities have been targeted for many of these disamenities, including the selection of toxic release sites. So I can't speak to the specific sites that I presented in Denver, but I can say that generally this is a broader pattern and an environmental justice issue that you can see across the US. Good question.
Great, thank you for that. And you mentioned the cliffhanger of the 2022 research that you are going to have going on. Is that going to focus on redline neighborhoods?
Yeah, so it's actually going to be focusing on essentially putting an even distribution of monitors for both noise pollution, and then things like camera traps to study mammals, and acoustic devices to study acoustically active species, so like birds and bats and herps. And we're going to even out that distribution in those target cities across all of those 4 grades. So everything from red line areas or neighborhoods to those green line neighborhoods, and then the 2 categories in between, so that we can better answer this question and sort of address that gap that I identified in our literature review about the lack of representation of studies in, I would say, urban ecology generally, but also looking at things like noise that are actually in redline communities.
Nice. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I just saw one come up in the chat from Sophie. Do you know of specific research or policy efforts that aim to counteract historical redlining practices in Colorado or elsewhere? Second part of the question is funding sources for urban gardens, building sound gardens in historically redlined neighborhoods, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, yeah, in Denver, they have what they're calling their game plan for a healthy city. So the voters actually voted to do equitable and sustainable urban planning into the future. We sort of voted to commit funding resources through tax dollars to some of the things that you're highlighting. So urban green space planning, targeting areas that have been historically underrepresented in terms of green space, right? So trying to get more green space to communities that have been underserved with respect to access to nature. And so Denver is actually one of several cities, I can't think of the other ones off the top of my head, but that is doing equitable urban planning and doing a lot of work to think about how to do this well, because there's some issues that come along with sort of green space revitalization, right? And so you can drive up prices in neighborhoods. And so how do we do this? How do we do this well is something that a lot of folks around here are thinking about. And so, yeah, there's a lot of energy around that in some cities. And I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to start thinking about research. I'm trying to align a lot of the research that I'm doing with the hopes of looking at some long-term trajectories about, you know, when we do this well, if we do this well, what does that look like for healthy wildlife communities, healthy human communities? And yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities to explore this through research. Good question.
Thank you so much. And we have more questions coming up in the chat. How have you strategized convincing other faculty of the importance of DEI efforts? And is there a critical mass required to get the institution to actually change anything?
Oof, that's a good question. Yeah, so the first part, how do I strategize sort of getting other faculty on board with DEI? I think there's a lot of ways to do this. I think for me, a lot of times it's you know, I think a lot of folks are scientists, and so thinking like a scientist, providing like data and information about why this matters and the benefits that arise from having, you know, a diverse workforce contributing to science, right? And I presented some of that in this talk. And so a lot of folks do really get on board if you present, you know, just the facts around it. But then others, I think there's the ethical argument that's really important too. And talking about some of the historic barriers that have led to underrepresentation, right? And so combining these different sources of information to sort of make the argument about why this matters is one step. But I do agree sort of with the second part of what you're saying is it's also, I would be lying if I didn't say that peer pressure didn't matter, right? And so like, I think having many people engaged and having sort of that critical mass does matter, and it does make a difference for getting others on board. So for me, what that looks like is organizing those that are really strong advocates and allies, and slowly sort of moving the needle, right? And then when there's enough of us organized and doing this work, the others sort of follow. And so I think, yes, having a critical mass is certainly helpful. And yeah, but you can start small and go bigger. And I will also say about institutional change, it also really helps if you can get the institutional leadership on board. Because when the institutional leadership says that this is important, then it helps to make your case, right? Because then you can draw from, well, yeah, this is also part of what leadership prioritizes. This is what the institution prioritizes. So not just the ethical argument, not just the practical, like data argument, but then this is what the institution prioritizes. So it's kind of multi-pronged, and I think all of that matters.
Great points, great points. Thank you so much. We do have one other question in the chat from Joe Gatos. So really great presentation. He thanks you. Has similar work been done looking at disparity in health parameters in rural areas of poverty, such as Indian reserves, rural Appalachia, etc.? I imagine acoustics may not be an issue in rural areas of poverty, but would you expect other impacts on wildlife as well?
Yeah, I'm less familiar on the wildlife side. I can say that a lot of work has been done looking at the health consequences of many inequities for the contrast that you're drawing. So Indian reservation lands, right, or rural areas. So on reservation lands, there's lots of evidence that there's greater air pollution and air quality issues, and there's health consequences from that. What I'm less familiar with, surprisingly, because this is much more my wheelhouse, is wildlife. I don't know if anybody's looked into the sort of ecology or wildlife side of that question.
Nice. Thank you for that. We do have one, we have time for maybe one more question from Paul. So very interesting and enlightening presentation on both the DEI in academia and social inequities related to ecological issues. Here is potentially controversial item on the second part of your talk. Have the effects of gentrification been studied in terms of effects on potential changes of the negative aspects of the environment, such as noise pollution in relation to wildlife in gentrified areas? This could be akin to a cause and effect study that supports your main thesis.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a little bit of a clarifying question here. So I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you asking, has gentrification been studied with respect to noise pollution, or with respect to wildlife, or with respect to impacts to human communities? I guess I'm a little unclear there. So I don't know if you mind jumping in, Paul.
Right, sure. Yeah, I can comment on that. Most of what you studied here and presented are associations. And, you know, I really believe it here, but it seems like, I'm not sure it's necessary to have a cause and effect study, you know, like a case controlled study or whatever, or, you know, a prospective longitudinal study. In other words, whether it's noise pollution or some other aspect of I guess, and I'm not sure, I'm still learning how to best use the language here.
No worries.
Other aspects of social injustice that could be mitigated, and reversed. And in fact, maybe a study of gentrification might provide some clues to kind of look back at areas and come up with maybe mitigating effects to some extent.
Yeah, I think kind of part of what you're talking about is where I'm interested in heading with some of this research and with the work that's happening in Denver, right, is sort of this equitable green space planning, but that could lead to gentrification if we're not doing that well. And so there might be opportunities to tease apart some of those factors. Now, the second part about like the cause and effect piece, again, it's really hard to do this in a true, these are obviously observational studies. So drawing those strong cause and effect conclusions. It's really hard to do this experimentally, right? But I think that there are opportunities with sort of this long-term research to look at the changes over time in things like anything that we've been talking about, including noise pollution and also noise mitigation, right? So like there could be opportunities to couple green space planning with noise mitigation and even experimentally look at that, right? In areas where you have green space, novel green space created, and have noise mitigation in areas where you don't. So yeah, I think there's opportunities to get at what I believe you're alluding to. And it would be nice if I can get the city of Denver on board with doing some of that research.
Well, thank you so much for all your time, Dr. Bombaci, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. We are at the hour, and so as Brooke mentioned earlier, for those that were able to join the call, please stay tuned for related reading materials from Dr. Bombaci related to the talk. And again, thank you so much for an amazing talk. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to meet everyone or have the chance to speak with you all.